Is this one of those where I'm going to need to do sign language for the people on the screen? I don't know sign language. No. I hope I just didn't sign something obscene. So. All right. Well, I am Matt Weeks. Go by Scriptjunkie on the Twitter and website, stuff like that. And I'm going to be talking about building how to break a secure network, how to break a network and build a secure one, specifically focusing on Windows Enterprise Networks. I know it's kind of a huge topic. I mentioned I changed the title a little bit. Decided it would really, the topic better fits the tent meeting revival style. And why? Well, because we need to go back and have a little bit of a repentance in our networks. First of all, we're going to look at the evil which is upon us. So first part of this presentation is I'm going to do a brief overview of different attacks and get the idea is this presentation is basically a couple of things. One of them is perspective on what all the attacks are coming in, because it's really easy, and a lot of the big mistakes that people make is just focusing in on one area and ignoring everything else. So we're going to do a quick survey and talk about a little bit of the perspective behind enterprise network security. And then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about your sins on the network and what you have done wrong on the network and why it is that you're vulnerable and how to fix that. And mainly concentrate on a few things that almost nobody does that will really break the attack playbook. And I know what you're thinking, because it's what everybody's thinking. It's like, well, that's not my problem. I got a pretty good network. Well, you know, I'm a pretty good person. Will not cut it when you get to heaven's gate, and I got a pretty good network, or at least I'm not as bad as that guy in the corner. Sorry, you guys, but you know, my network isn't as bad as their network. That also doesn't cut it, and so really, what we need here is a little bit of a rebirth. So first of all, the bad news. Let's talk about what is out there that threatens us. And so, first of all, attackers going in. A lot of this is going to be reviewing the start. You're going for different levels of access. Usually limited user, escalate to local admin, gain control of other systems, lateral movement, and then domain admin are usually kind of the classic steps of an intrusion. You also sometimes see internal network access. Maybe somebody has, you know, connected something or just got into a VPN. You have access inside the network but not control of a host, or internal server. Maybe I've hacked one server but I don't have the standard workstation approach. All of these are different levels of access. It shouldn't be possible to get from outside to any of these or from one of these to the next unless you already have higher privileges. And so what we're going to do is kind of diagram out how are the different ways that you break those security barriers. So either you start off with an external server attack. Is there any way we can like shift this higher? I don't know.
Okay, that works.
How about that? Ghetto.
Would you like a spot on the AV team?
No, that's all right. So you can either start with an external server attack, real common SQL injection, password guessing, all of those, your favorite web attacks, that'll get you control of a server. You might be able to do a password attack such as the chap crack and get access to a VPN. Gives you internal network access, but not necessarily control of a system. That's super common. If your main business is web facing, yeah, obviously that's going to be your biggest concern. But here we're talking a lot primarily about Windows Enterprise Networks. Client-side exploits are, you know, the go-to method for your pen testers, APT, insert your favorite, whoever. And you're going to see a lot of, used to be PDF exploits, now all the cool kids are doing Java exploits or Office exploits, or social engineering. So that's super common, social engineering attacks. You're talking about, once again, signed Java applets, Office macros, just send somebody an executable with the icon of a document and tell them to click it. And yep, sure enough, all those things work. Those will get you access as a limited user. Also, not as common because it demands some physical cost and proximity, but physical item attacks where, let's say, you leave CDs or thumb drives lying around the parking lot, those have auto-run malware or, once again, the same type of, looks like a legit document, double-click it, it's an executable. Lately, you've also started to see some of the HID spoofing USB devices. So it's got a custom hardware. It will emulate a keyboard when you plug it into a system. That will then just simply enter commands, and it'll be running as a local user. All this gets you limited user access. It's also possible, if you're a little more crazy, a little more advanced, or you're on site, to use physical access to get full control of a system immediately. So there's a million different ways you could do this. Direct access to the hard drive, FireWire port in memory, or any number of ways that you can, with physical access, own a box. That's going to give you a local admin full control of that one system. Or supply chain compromise. If you're, you pick your favorite agency and you can just put, backdoors in hardware. That would be the pinnacle. Here we're going to talk mostly about the network attacks. So these bottom two, there are ways of dealing with that, but I'm not going to talk about them here. And next. All right. Once you obtain access as a limited user, it's probably going to be your first step. How do you actually break those barriers to get increased access? So very commonly you find, pen testers will find weak file, service, or registry permissions, which will allow them to elevate their privileges to local admin. So a really common exploit in Metasploit was the PML service HP printer driver. You could swap out the executable because it wasn't protected, restart the service, and then it's running as system. Or another thing you can do is look at see if you can find plain text passwords that admins have accidentally left around in scripts and the registry and elsewhere in password.doc files. And if you can find those, once again, that can escalate you to local admin, or even higher, but in this case, to local admin. You could also try local exploits. So very commonly, the get system Win32 local exploits, which get you, again, access as local admin. There are plenty of those to go around as well. And finally, not as common, but still there, you could guess or brute force the local admin password. Once again, that breaks the barrier. You're up at local admin. Once you have local admin, the first thing everybody does is dump the hashes, dump the credentials, and see if you can replay those, pass a hash to other systems on the network, and get lateral movement. You might also, if you're starting with limited user, try to go directly after other systems, and you could do that by either, you could see if maybe your current user account has admin privileges. That's rare, but it could happen over a remote system. You could try internal server-side attacks. You could say, maybe there's some box on the internal network which hasn't been patched in 4 years, and you can hit it with the Net API 08067 exploit, which happens, or PXE attacks, other exploits within the local network. Finally, you could do NTLM attacks. So this is relaying NTLM, all kinds of different ways you can cause people to initiate an NTLM request out, by putting links places with shortcuts to a UNC path, by emailing out, all kinds of different ways you can get somebody just looking at a page, could be an HTML page, or looking at a shared folder, and you cause them to generate a request out to you, which you then relay to a third party, and now you've hijacked their credentials. Super popular. Also have cracking NTLM passwords. If you can simply observe any NTLM authentication, since it's based on the password hash, you can crack that offline at high speed, billions of times per second, and without worry of lockout or anything like that, and get that password. Finally, you could also do attacks through shares. This is probably the last common method that I've seen or read about in a lot of other reports. And so this is things like dropping executables on the shares, dropping DLLs for DLL preloading. We'll talk a little bit more about these later, but basically other people who use that share can be infected and you can take over their accounts. So that gets you lateral movement. The final big step that you want to take as a bad guy is escalate to domain admin full system access. 99% of the time, how you're going to get there is you're going to steal credentials. So either you're going to hijack an active login, maybe you have access to a box which a DA or other highly privileged domain account is logged into interactively, and so you just dump their password out of memory, or you could also steal their hash out of memory, or hijack their token, or steal their Kerberos ticket. The token will use either the hash or the Kerberos ticket internally, and basically hijack their login and use it to obtain DA privileges. Or you might with elevated local admin privileges, you have access to other things that you didn't before. You might be able to find a plain text password elsewhere in scripts or registry. If you don't find one of those, another thing people sometimes do is cause something to break, which will cause an admin to log in and keylog the password as they log in. So you could do that. You could crack domain cache credentials. Even if an admin isn't logged in, you can't get them to log in. If they have logged in at any point in the past, chances are their credentials are going to be cached, and those are salted hashes, but once again, you can brute force them offline at very high speed. And finally, you could deobfuscate LSA secret saved passwords. So basically what this is, a lot of times you'll see service accounts, sometimes highly privileged domain accounts will be scheduled to run automatically as batch or service logins. Those passwords are simply stored obfuscated in LSA secrets, and you can just deobfuscate those and have the plain text password. So all these are basically the ways that we've seen to escalate to DA. We also see some of the network attacks. If you have internal network access, we mentioned you can do, it's some of the same attacks, server-side attacks. You could also attack internal web applications, go after internal servers, and continue to escalate your privileges with that. Or even attacking clients, hijacking traffic with WPAD or ARP attacks, or doing direct, if you have control of an internal server, you could do direct client-side attacks, and you're much more likely, depending on what internal website you have, to hit a highly privileged account directly from there than you would be from outside the account, outside the network, where they're more likely to be locked down. So basically, here's your attack graph of, this is how, based on my unscientific but reasonably complete survey of pen testers and incident reports. So this is how people break those security barriers and escalate their privileges to own your network and steal your chili. In addition to simply breaking the barriers, the other big point of activity as far as an intrusion is how to maintain access and get data in and out of that network to your agents, which are allowing you to do these actions. I think it was Raphael Mudge just said the other day, it's sometimes not hard to get access, it's hard to get the data back. And so different ways of doing that: direct IP communication over HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, super common. Often that's to dynamically DNS registered domains or other registered domains set up for an attack. If you want to, those are probably the most popular. If you want to get a little more sophisticated, you can use DNS exfiltration, all communication over DNS. Within a network, do see occasionally communication over shares. It's also possible, we've now seen a few botnets using Tor as a backend. This is advantageous for the bad guys because there's no single point of failure now, and it's hard to find that C2 node, and so they can simply issue those commands over Tor. USB drives, again, if this is an isolated network, an air-gapped network, USB drives are often the only way to go. And so you've seen that with, of course, famous attacks like Stuxnet and others, which I'll probably keep using as examples. And getting, again, a little bit more rare, but definitely interesting, you're seeing webmail-based Gmail, Evernote, Pastebin, other mechanisms of communication in and out which use third-party data sharing servers. And then finally, for some people, they can use compromised sites, legitimate websites, and put their commands there. This is, of course, where the comment crew gets their name from, by putting comments in legitimate websites and using those as command and control channels. All right, so now we've seen how, so we've seen the quick survey of how the attacks happen. Let's talk about how we can start to defend against those. First of all, your gold standard is going to be the air-gapped network. I think it's kind of interesting. You know, UC San Diego had a quote in one of their security pages which says, the only way to completely secure your computer is to disconnect it from the internet. And I always kind of wondered what, you know, the Iranian nuclear program thought of that quote, but, you know, I don't know. So it's still not, you know, nothing's 100%, but it is still the gold standard, and it is a heck of a lot harder to compromise. If you're going to do this, you got to make sure you covered the physical personnel security aspects, as well as blocking USB, which is actually blocking USB storage, which is actually really easy to do just by disabling the USB store driver. You don't have to buy a ridiculously expensive DLP product or something like that. If there's one admin who has to do it, you can exclude that system, but you could just block it everywhere else. And it's actually not too hard to do. Although I'd probably advise coming up with other ways of getting your data in and out. And finally, everything without an air gap, you really need to isolate as much as possible. And so how do you do that? Because I know most of you probably aren't going to be able to go home to your bosses and say, hey, CEO, we need to just unplug. So for all the networks that you live on, just remember this thing. If there's one thing know that default allow is the devil. So how are you going to defeat the devil? Number one, isolate your workstations. You need to allow no direct connections out, no DNS queries out. That's where a lot of people drop off. And basically force all communication out through a proxy. So this breaks all the direct IP communication, and it also allows you to apply a whitelist to it. Definitely got to whitelist the domains where you allow your people to go to, and that's going to break a lot of these other ones. I would also put a high level emphasis on blocking. Default allow doesn't just apply to going outside your network. It also applies to inside your network. Don't allow your workstations to communicate with each other. You can use features in a lot of enterprise switches and routers to do that. Some of these are difficult to apply, especially doing something like that if you already have a big established network. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize in this presentation was not what to do necessarily with a big established network, but how to build a secure one from scratch. One of the problems I think we have is 99% of the funding and business in information security is coming from the big companies, which are established and have security budgets. And so what we have is a lot of band-aids that we keep putting on problems and not fixing the root of them because it's too hard to redo everything, which I think is interesting. It reminds me of basically the immigration debate 30 years ago in 1986. Big problem. Millions of illegal immigrants to the United States, just looking for jobs. What are we going to do? They came out with a solution which addressed those who had come here illegally, because that's what everybody was talking about, and gave them basically a way to become citizens, but didn't address the problem for the people who wanted to come here, the new people. Well, here we are 30 years later, and we're in the same hole that we were 30 years ago because everybody just wanted to talk about the people who are here and not the new people that would come later. I think if we explain how to do networking right for the networks that are established, in 30 years, when we will have all built new networks, we're going to be set. So moving on, you want to isolate your servers. I talked about whitelist, especially secure those. You want to lock those down even stricter. Don't allow your admins out. And what are you going to do? Well, you're going to block all those direct communication. You're going to be blocking some of the internal network. Tor is going to be blocked if you have a whitelist policy, because it's not going to end up on whitelists. USB drives, we talked about stopping those. Webmail, data sharing sites. This one I know is going to get a little painful, but I would advise blocking the random data sharing sites outside your network. You might have some complaints on those. And finally, you get to compromise sites, and I'm sorry I can't really help you here because there's not a whole lot you can do when the website is legitimate and you need to go there. Excuse me. All right, next, what we want to take a lot of time talking about is controlling the hosts. And so a couple things you want to do. Disable common social engineering vectors. We talked, this is, again, still a lot of review. Disabling Java and Office macros. You want to stop your privilege escalation. Those are all tricks that you need to be taking seriously. You can check for things like the insecure service permissions by running the Metasploit script for service permissions escalate. You can test these on your network. And if you don't have the ability to, obviously, pay a security consulting company to come in and do it. You also want to prevent some of the remote local account logins. We'll hit this later as we talk about never allowing passwords. Now, that might be a little bit of a surprise because that's what basically everybody used, but boy, if there's one thing that you take out of this presentation, it's never allow passwords. Passwords are the devil. Passwords are the devil because of about 15 different reasons. Number one, even if you tell them not to, admins will be leaving their passwords in scripts and on the registry and just handy-dandy things, or they just save their passwords. Bad guys are going to find them, steal them, and own your network. They can be dumped from memory. We mentioned this before, the Mimikatz attack, now in Meterpreter and Windows Credential Editor. If you own a box, you can dump that password from memory, and it is good forever. Or until they change that password, which is probably going to be, weeks or months, if that, and going to give attackers plenty of opportunity to move on. They can be keylogged. Once again, basically any system that your admins are administering, they remote desktop into it, I can pull their password just with a keylogger. I can probably guess them, even if so many, you tell your people to have secure passwords, it is not within the human ability for a significant portion of humanity to create genuinely secure passwords. You have your super complicated, I need upper, lower numbers, and they're going to type password 1 with a capital P. Somebody's going to do it, and it's going to get guessed. And, you can continue to try to play whack-a-mole all over the place, but it can happen. Finally, everybody reuses them, especially if you've given your people a strict password policy. Great, now I had to come up with this super long, complicated password. Well, what's going to happen the next time I have to sign up for something online? Well, when I have to sign up for RockU online, I'm just going to use that password which I used. And then what the heck do you think is going to happen to RockU online? Somebody's plain text password list is going to be dumped, or some hacker's going to hack that, or they're going to hack somebody at home where they download and run every app they can find, and they're going to steal that password that they're using at home on all these other services and go use it on your network. Unless the dump is public, this is one of those attack vectors that your pen testers will never tell you about because they're not allowed to hack your users at home, but it happens all the time in the real world. Finally, they're really hard to remember. And, we can kind of laugh at this, but I just saw a study the other day which quantified the fact that more mental exertion is being used in remembering these, especially the long, complicated passwords, that it actually measurably impacts performance throughout the rest of the day. So you are literally hurting your business that you're supposed to support. Social engineering. Now, even if your users wouldn't, and they will, give up a password to somebody who calls them on the phone and says, hey, I'm IT tech support, I need your password. Even your admins, if they get an email spoofed from another admin which says, hey, I need you to take a look at this ticket, they click on it, it looks just like their, whatever admin console, they're going to type in their password, and it's not just users which get affected by this. Really, anybody on a spoofed website could forget to check the address bar and end up entering their credentials to somewhere else. Once again, very, very frequent. You have passing the hash, an intrinsic problem that you're never going to fix until you get rid of passwords, although it will take more than that to fix it, is passing the hash. Once I get these hash dumps, which are these pot of gold, not only can I take this credential that I found without even cracking it, that's been stored, and reuse it endlessly, but there's giant dumps of all of the credentials of everybody on the network on your DCs, and any backup of your DCs, and any box or any of the VM hypervisors which manage your DC. So if I get access to any of those, then I've got this giant pot of gold which I can use to just own your network. We have easy lockouts or online brute forces. Two problems. Even if I don't have any access to your network at all, and I just hate your guts because you're Sony, and Sony, and I can, you expose one service to the outside world, email, and with just a list of usernames, which is super easy to guess, I can lock out all of your users with no access whatsoever, causing great pain and suffering on your network. And if you don't do that, then I can do an online brute force and get inevitably many passwords. So you can fail at one, you can fail at the other, but most people just fail at both because I've got a limit of 3 or 4 or 5, and then I can do a limited brute force, try the same password on everybody's account. And there's really no way around this aside from pain and suffering and evil. Then you have NTLM Relay. A couple years ago, actually a DEF CON 19 presentation by Zach Faisal. Are you here? I know you're at the conference somewhere. No. Called Network Guest to Domain Admin in 60 Seconds. Probably not exaggerating because NTLM Relay has been done so many times in so many different ways. It would be funny if it wasn't so sad. NTLM authentication, cache credential offline cracking. We talked about this before. Just by observing one authentication, you can crack it offline, as well as the saved credentials, domain cache credentials. And finally, you've got a painful post-attack cleanup. Now, this is another one which you don't hear a lot about, because in a pen test, you're just concerned about getting access. But what happens when you've been owned and you have to recover from that is a big deal. It makes a huge deal in the impact of an intrusion on businesses. And the possibility of reentry attacks if you forget to change a password is a huge deal, and is a big deal in the real world, because if somebody is actually targeting you and hacks into your network, even if you kick them out, find all their callbacks, kill everything, if they can get back in and reuse one of those same admin creds, then they're going to be back in, and that frequently happens in the real world. So what can we do about it? Thankfully, we can fix this. There's 2 simple rules. Number 1, force smart card login for all users, especially your admins. And number 2, force Kerberos by denying NTLM. For anybody you can't apply those rules to, deny network and RDP login to any local accounts, any non-smart card accounts. And then if you want for extra credit, you could also disable secondary login service, and they couldn't be used for privilege escalation either. And so what does that do? So force smart card and block NTLM. If you do that, what you're going to have, I know people are trying to write this down, slides will be up on my website. Number 1, hashes will never be used in authentication. As a matter of fact, for every user on which this is true, you will never have your permanent credentials in memory or on disk on any system. Because in order to, the only way you'll be able to authenticate across the network is Kerberos, and in order to get a Kerberos ticket, you will have to use a smart card private key, which is never leaving the smart card. So hashes are never going to be used. That hash database is going to be pretty useless. You're not physically able to pull the private key from the smart cards. Your users, you're not relying on your users to make good security decisions. They can't reuse passwords. They can't choose bad passwords. They can't give them away. When people, I can't help but laugh when people say, oh, he chose a bad password. Oh, well, when you got this, it's no wonder you got owned. Well, if you hand sharp knives to toddlers, what do you think they're going to do with it? Don't hand sharp knives to toddlers. Don't give people a million opportunities to break your security. You also don't need to worry about lockouts or online brute forces. Your admins can't make mistakes like leaving the passwords in shared drives and scripts. The only way to hijack creds is by hijacking an active logon from the box that the admin is interactively logged into. And even if you take that curb ticket, it's only good temporarily. And so logins from the past aren't going to come back and bite you. And finally, it's easier on users' memory because you only have to remember a short pin, if that. And it's a heck of a lot easier to clean up from because they don't have to change it. So what does that do to our attack graph? That breaks almost every, like we said, there's one more way, but it breaks almost every way that I've seen to escalate your privileges to highly privileged domain accounts. It also breaks a whole lot of other attacks. I know of no other security measure that you can do that will break more of the attack playbook than this. And it blows my mind that almost nobody talks about it. Part of the reason is smart cards have been around for a while, but disabling NTLM has not. That's only been done, that's only available since Windows Server 2008 R2 or later. So you do need Windows Server 2008 R2 or later on your domain controller. And there's a lot of, if you look at like flipping that on, Microsoft warns you like, OMG, if something depends on NTLM, it's going to die. You can tweak that setting to only disable NTLM to Windows systems or systems in your domain, which then you'd still be able to use NTLM to authenticate to the printer. And then, anyway, there's lots of different ways you can do this. Yes?
For the domain, does it just have to be that server or the forest functional level?
The functional level, I don't know about the functional level. I don't know about forest. I would say for the domain, it would have to be, the domain has to be at least the Server 2008 R2 functional level. So once again, there are some places where you might not be able to do this, but if you're building a new network, by all means do it, and see if you can do it in your own network. I was having some arguments with some people about, oh no, you can't disable NTLM. I've seen it done on at least 3 small to medium-sized business networks, fully cut off and killed. So it can be done. It can be done even on established networks, so see if you can do it. Another feedback I got was, what about Secure ID? Yes? So machine-to-machine is basically the one stored cred that you can't address with this. And so what I would do for that is actually shorten the time frame. By default, they're automatically generated every 30 days. I would shorten that down to just a few days, and then the creds aren't going to be good for as long. So you're right. That is the one place where you do still have to watch out for. But it's a lot easier because it's not a user remembering the password. It's just a machine, and it will come up with its own password, and you don't have to worry about that. Secure ID, unfortunately, I was hoping, hey, it's made by RSA. These guys are smart crypto guys. Unfortunately, it does not fix a lot of those problems. It's a layer on top of Windows authentication. The RSA server will hold all the seeds, which basically decide what the one-time code is going to be, and they hold all of the plain text passwords for all of your users who are using Secure ID. When you log in with that token, that plain text password is given to Windows, and everything else is the same inside. So you still have the hash password dumping, social engineering, passing the hash. Social engineering, if you social engineer somebody out of their one-time token, you can reuse it, but only for a limited time, so that's not as bad. But you still also have things like NTLM, relay. You do have these pot of gold, which now includes the plain text passwords, and you have quite painful post-compromise cleanup, since now you may have to even replace all your tokens. But it does fix the user issues with passwords. So it does fix users choosing bad passwords, that kind of thing. All right, so we got one way left which can be used to obtain DA high-level admin privileges, and that is by hijacking an active login. You want to lock those down as much as possible. Assign dedicated admin workstations. Don't allow them to browse the internet. Don't allow anything else in the network to go connect to them. And the biggest thing that you need to do is don't allow them to give away their creds. So this mark privileged accounts as sensitive and cannot be delegated stops one way that could happen. But the biggest way is not using remote management tools, which are going to place those reusable creds in a remote system's memory, whether that's a ticket grant ticket, a hash, or password. So how do you do that? Use the ones on the right, not the ones on the left. You can still use file shares, netuse, remote registry, service control manager, MMC snap-ins, PowerShell, unless you tell it to do something weird with authentication. You can still use psexec unless you give it specific creds. And I mentioned AMT with Kerberos. It's not just Microsoft systems. There are third-party tools which also support this. On the left, what you can't, stealable is console physical login, so only physically log into your workstations. Don't save credentials in batch or service account logins, and don't remote desktop. Oh no, no remote desktop. That's the painful one for admins. That's the normal one where they're going to be leaving their creds lying around. And so put together, I have not seen another way of preventing credential reuse with remote desktop. So I just put together one real quick here, and hopefully this will work. So that was real exciting. Anyway, I got a script. I got a video on YouTube. Anyway, you can check out scriptjunkie.us if you care. Basically, script will create a temporary local admin account with a 120-bit randomly generated password that's only good for a few hours, and then automatically log you in with that remote desktop account. So you basically just point it at an IP, hit enter, wait a few seconds, opens up an admin remote desktop session on that system, but that's not your domain admin creds. That's only good for that system and only for a few hours. That basically solves the reusable creds problem, and it still allows you to RDP in with admin privileges and fix whatever you need to fix. So I highly advise doing that. So credentials, like I said, are kind of the big issue. When people read pen test reports, it's like, oh, I hacked this one server, and then, oh, I just stole the creds and owned the domain. But really, I found this one vulnerability. I think the bigger problem is you've got creds lying around all your servers, which are good for owning the domain, so that you only need to hack one. But even if you fix the credential aspect, we do still need to fix the exploit aspect. Exploits get a lot of attention. A lot of people say, if you want to fix the whole problem of cyber attacks, you need to fix vulnerable software or technology, which I think is kind of funny, because if you look at the attack graph even if you fixed every exploit ever, this is what it looks like. Some very important attack vectors are stopped, but it certainly doesn't shut down the cyber attack landscape. So how do we address these? Because we do have to address these. Well, number one, web apps, your biggest exposure. If you're building a network from the start up, don't allow, what happens is this creep comes up, somebody puts together some random application at one time, leaves, and then it's vulnerable, and it's just a backdoor into your systems. You've got to, if you're going to have somebody build you a web app, that's got to be in the contract. Security and fixes have got to be in the contract. You can't accept people just giving you applications without source code, without an audit. And you have to scan and bug fix those regularly yourself. You have to have somebody who can do that on your team. Otherwise, you've got no business running a custom web app. Thank you. Amen. So, next, you got to, on your host, force exploit mitigations. A lot of talk about Emmet. You can, even without Emmet, force mandatory DEP. You can even force mandatory ASLR on all modules system-wide with a registry change. Not done commonly. It will break some things like Skype, but that's what I use all the time, and I don't know if it still breaks Skype. And you can now do that full system-wide just with a registry setting and use Emmet to add additional layers of protection in there. That really does make exploit development a whole lot harder by having all of those in place everywhere. Next, patch. Patch the vulnerabilities which are actually getting exploited. The problem with vuln scanners is sometimes they'll give you 1 million results and it'll be like, high severity, you have SSL v2 enabled. Well, that's not really going to get you owned. You need to look at, unfortunately, you do need to put some brain cycles into figuring out what you really need to fix and do that. And then put vulnerable apps in VM isolation. Something not a ton of people do. You're starting to see this a little bit more. But your virtual machine sandbox is going to be a heck of a lot stronger than anything else, because it's going to be a smaller attack surface than your kernel attack surface, and it's an entirely separate attack surface. So the way to do that is you could either use a commercial one. I know there's Bromium. They claim they have one, but I'm not really sure because they don't use full VMs, so I'm a little suspicious of the Bromium implementation. Invincia is based on VMware, so that should be pretty solid. You could use cubes on your local system. That's probably not ready for enterprise-wide deployment yet, but that's a really interesting way to do VM isolation using Xen. You can use the VMware View client and kind of roll your own, which is what Invincia is based on. Citrix has a lot of application virtualization products. I'm not sure if any of them have that security barrier in between the application and the operating system, but you might be able to work something with one of their offerings. I'm not as familiar with those as with some of these others. Or you could just roll your own with a simple hypervisor, either locally or remotely, and use something like VNC to just share that one application. And so requirements, if you're going to deploy one of these, you have to make sure these are met. Number one, it's not going to make sense unless that VM has restricted network access. I'm talking about a VM where you put your Adobe Reader, your Office, all that kind of local applications. Don't let them talk with anything on the network at all. You also need to prevent host code execution. Don't let them write to the registry. Don't let them write to startup folders. If they're going to write to, say, documents folder, restrict it to that and make sure they don't have access to anything else. So I'd recommend a document VM, like I mentioned, and a browser VM to put your browser also in another sandbox. This one won't be as secure. You will have to open up network access to that, but it will be very strong. And I have a demo, which I'm sure this video is going to totally work. It's got a different codec. it's got a different codec, which also isn't on this box, but if my Windows system wasn't blue screening, it would work. Anyway, imagine you're clicking on a file and it opens up in a window, and that's it. Oh my gosh, I'm almost out of time. So that's VM isolation. Next thing, foot stomper, don't use file shares. File shares are the devil. This is, again, something I don't think I've heard people say, but file shares were never designed with security in mind. So you've got executable planting, DLL preloading, all kinds of applications are vulnerable to that. Any shortcut which a user can write to, if you double click that shortcut, it can launch any command. Also very commonly used by bad guys. You can infect any script you can write to. So simply don't use Windows file shares. Instead use something like a CMS, something like MediaWiki, Joomla. Those were designed, the browser interface was designed as a security barrier and is not going to allow somebody to just programmatically own everybody else who looks at that file share. It is still okay to use a file share like a home user drive, which is only accessible to one user, or one which admins put scripts in and push out. As long as normal users can't write to it and have it be seen by other users, it can still be used. But as far as user sharing files, don't use Windows file shares. Finally, code whitelisting. This one takes a lot of flack from all sides. Either it's the best thing since sliced bread or it's useless because I have a PowerShell script. If you do this right, I absolutely do think it is meaningful. For example, you look at a lot of attacks are wrong code attacks, I call them. Both of Stuxnet's 0 days, which jumped the air gap, relied on tricking Windows or another program to silently load a DLL on the thumb drive instead of the legitimate DLL. If you had whitelisted what DLLs you allowed to be loaded by hash and signature and all that, then Stuxnet, Flames, Dooku's, Gauss's 0 days, which allowed it to hop the USB barrier, would all be broken. These attacks would be hard broken. Even if you have a PowerShell script, you cannot bypass that. So there are some very significant attack vectors in which whitelisting is 100% effective. There are also attack vectors in which it's not as effective, such as preventing persistence, but you can still do that, and you have to lock down all the other scripting languages which you might have on your host if you're going to do that. So in summary, air gap what you can. For everything else, whitelist. Whitelist all of the different aspects of network communication. Kill passwords and NTLM. You force Kerberos and smart cards. Use strong exploit mitigation. Put your programs in isolated VMs, and please do not use Windows shared folders. And in the end, your attack graph is going to look like this. Can't promise 100%, but it will make most attackers' lives genuinely miserable. So with that, are there any questions? Yes.
Where can you get a smart card vendor and key infrastructure?
What I would actually recommend doing is if you go to search, I think it's MSDN. Microsoft has a list of Microsoft validated smart card middleware vendors, and so you can just look at that. It's like it's a really big list, and so you can just go look at those different vendors and see which ones, see what their smart card offerings are. There's a lot out there, and I don't know if I can recommend one over another because I haven't had experience with them. Yes.
So on the smart card front, I just spent a week with one of Microsoft ninjas on this front.
Right.
His opinions on the smart card and Kerberos aspect. He said it's a lot of effort there that doesn't pay back because apparently still in memory these hashes are computed even if NTLM is disabled.
You have them, but you can't use them.
In everything that's disabled.
Right. So everywhere NTLM is shut off, that is, those hashes are not going to be useful. Sorry, in the back, you had your hand up. Yes.
Two comments. The article hasn't been refreshed as of last fall, but as of last fall, Windows 7 and presumably Windows 8 cannot publish BitLocker recovery keys into Active Directory without NTLM enabled. So,
Interesting.
Yeah, so if you're going to use BitLocker, you're not going to get
Okay.
recovery keys in AD without NTLM on all your PCs. That's kind of a pain. And if you look at Thread SSP and smart card logins over RDP, because that shouldn't send any hashes.
It will leave a if I understand it correctly, it'll leave a reusable Kerberos ticket. I have verified the double hop happens by logging in over RDP, and once again, it's using a Kerberos ticket instead of a permanent cred. Right. Right. So it's better, but that's still the case. Go ahead.
Regarding RDP, is it not possible to use smart card authentication for that instead of a temporary password?
You can use smart card, but if you use your smart card, like we were talking about, then that's your account, which has the TGT on that system. So if somebody owns that system at that point in time, they can steal that and reuse it on other systems. So if you use a temporary account, then it's only useful on that system.
Two more questions.
All right, go ahead.
So one of the big challenges that's often cited about smart cards is just the effort to distribute and support them.
Right.
Do you have any advice or suggestions on that?
I'm sorry. I'll give you a hug.
What's your website?
Scriptjunkie.us. And finally,
I have one question.
go ahead.
What are your thoughts on like eliminating NTLM with federated authentication models like SAML and VDFs?
I have not. I'm not as familiar with some of the other ones. This is just what, as far as Windows supports. So that's basically what I picked. So I think I probably have to run.
Great job.
Thank you. And for everybody else, you can find me later if you've got